Shall we get started?
All right.
Okay.
Welcome to Behind the Scene Talks About Art. We're going to see the contributions that African Americans have made to the DIA's collection that start as early as 1900s, or late 1800s, and go all through contemporary time. And we see all the ways that African Americans have been able to develop their talent, from early artists who didn't have any training, who might have copied European pictures, but then learned how to do it themselves, all the way to contemporary that are doing what all contemporary artists do, relating to the times they live in. Next slide. In our own voice, African American art. Yes, we're going to start with the late 1800s and go through contemporary. But we again are going to see all the different wonderful ways African Americans have created art, and how fortunate the DIA has in its rich collection of African American art. Next slide. Now this is Ellen's Isle La Katrine by Robert Selden Duncanson. Now the special thing about Robert is he's one of us. He's from Monroe, Michigan. His father was a house painter. Now Robert was not trained. Robert copied European paintings until he got the idea of how to do it himself. And he became the first critically acclaimed African American artist in Europe, because abolitionists paid for him to go to Scotland and to Italy and to France. Now this is in the Scottish Highlands. He had been here many times. And the critics absolutely adored the way he used light in the sky and the way that light was reflected onto the lake below. Now this is based on the Sir Walter Scott's poem, Lady in the Lake of 1810, of which he was very familiar. And it's such a peaceful, beautiful, breathtaking scene. Now, Robert passed on 1 year later, so this was done late in life. But he had a studio in Detroit, and it was part of the Underground Railway. And we also have several other paintings done by him in the same wonderful little corner room, little corner gallery on the second floor in the American wing, where we're telling you about artists, African American artists that you might not have known much about, that were early artists. Next slide. Now here's a picture of Robert. Doesn't he look like a dignified gentleman? But he was critically acclaimed and the first to be so designated. Next slide. Now, right below Robert's picture is this glorious piece of furniture. And this was done by an African American craftsman. That gorgeous wood is mahogany, which is from the Caribbean. And our African American curator reupholstered it for us, or got it reupholstered, so it looks more like it probably would have looked when it was new. Whatever it came in, she didn't feel was appropriate. Now, it's very difficult to get African American pieces because they are so beautiful, and the families that have them pass them down from generation to generation, and they're not available. They're not on the open market. They're not for sale. And so he was a free African American in the Carolinas, in North Carolina. His father had been a craftsman and trained him, and he employed craftsmen, but he also employed slaves. Now, he had to get along with the businessmen around him, and we don't know what his relationship was to these slaves, but we can assume he was teaching them a craft. And so that was valuable, so that when they were freed, they would have a skill. And we think he probably paid the people that worked for him. Now, he was the fifth wealthiest person in his company, very, very successful. He would go to the homes all over the South with his papers proving that he was free, and he would measure where his furniture was going to go. He would also do different areas in the home, because his signature piece was the S curve. Look at the arms on either end of this beautiful sofa, that beautiful S curve. Turn to the next slide.
Okay. since we are few here, I just want to make sure that the slides are showing up in the
Oh, sure.
recording.
Yes,
So it'll be just 1 moment. Ah, okay. So is it okay if I go through the slides this way? Because I know that this will show up on the recording. I think the recording was getting stuck on that
Oh,
first slide. Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we'll go to the next one. Thank you.
Please go to the next slide.
Oh, even when after this one? Okay. Is
Go to
that
the
okay?
next slide. please.
Okay, is this
We're
one?
done with this one. We're not
Okay.
done, but it still has, there's some
Okay.
more parts to this
Okay,
that you have to see on the next slide.
sure. Okay. Ah, I see. On my screen, it was going to the next slide. I apologize. Okay. Well, it'll be just one. Just a little bit stuck right now. Screen is. Okay, well, we'll just keep
Now,
doing this.
here we
Okay.
see the Thomas Day Bannister, that S curve I told you about. And here we see the sign that tells you that he was the first Black cabinet maker in Milton, born in 1824, passed on in 1861. And it's showing you his sign outside of his old Union Tavern. Now let's go to the next slide. And here is the statue. He was so well known, and he was apparently popular enough that they did a slide in his honor. That's there to this day. Next slide.
Okay.
And here are two wonderful busts. They would fit on a desk. They're made out of marble. And Edmonia Lewis has a wonderful background. Her mother is Native American, Ojibwe, just like Hiawatha here. And her father was from the Caribbean, so her father was Black. Now, we see this is based on the Longfellow poem about the Tales of Hiawatha. And Hiawatha himself is in traditional native garb, but she's put Minnehaha in a European dress with pearls. They also have European features because she had to sell this to people, and people wanted to see European features. Now, she was born and raised in the United States. She went to Oberlin College, but she had difficulties there, some racial difficulties. And she left Oberlin in her senior year, just before she could graduate, and went to New York and made plaster busts of various Union heroes, and made enough money from that, together with contributions from abolitionists and a brother who was slightly involved in the gold rush and had funds to support her sister, even though he lived out west. Now, I love what she did here. She proved the critics wrong. The critics said, oh, marble is too heavy. It's too hard for women to handle. And there was, of course, tons of marble in Italy. And she had gone to Italy and she carved these exquisite, detailed busts out of marble, showing the critics how wrong they were. And when you come to the museum, you're going to see, I mean, the detail can be seen on the slides, but it's even more exquisite when you see them up close. So we love the fact that she proved them wrong. Now, she lived in an artist colony in Italy, and she would periodically come back to the US to sell her work and go back to Italy, because it wasn't fun to live in the United States then. If you were of mixed race, as she was, it was much nicer to live in Italy, where they treated her well. Now, she went to England in the early 1900s and passed on there. Next slide. Now here she is. Isn't that a sweet face? Such a gentle and lovely look on her face. She would be fun to know. Next slide. Now here we have the opposite of Robert Duncanson. This is Henry Osawa Tanner. Henry was from a wealthier family. His father was a bishop in the African American Methodist Church. And so Henry was very familiar with biblical studies and with the Bible. And he'd been to the Holy Land many, many times. And he did 15 different versions of the same scene. But critics feel that we have one of the best versions. Now, Impressionism was very popular then, so we can see the influence of Impressionism here. We see a short, sketchy brushstrokes, and we see minimal detail. The baby Jesus is just a bundle in the lap of Mary. He doesn't have any halos over the Holy Couple. They are simply fleeing from the Holy Land into Egypt because of Herod's decree that he was so frightened that Jesus was going to be a higher role than he was. He was going to kill, and he did, every child that was 2 years old or younger. And so an angel had told Joseph to go to Egypt, get out of there quickly. And then the same angel told him when to come back, when Herod had died. So this could also reflect the migration of Blacks from the south to the north, thinking that things were going to be better. But Henry was one of the first artists to be elected into the American Academy of Design in the early 1900s. And he was a fully trained artist. He trained at the Philadelphia School of Art, and Thomas Eakins was one of his teachers, but segregation reared its ugly head there too. So Eakins and other teachers had to go to Henry's home to teach him, because it was just too difficult to teach him at the school. So Henry decided in 1891 to live in France, because shortly after this is when our wonderful Supreme Court upheld the separate but equal clause, which then went on for over 60 years to make things very uncomfortable in the South. And Henry didn't want any part of that. So he stayed in Italy. And this is what a lot of African Americans who could afford it did, because Europe at the time was very open and friendly toward different races. Next slide. And here is Henry. Doesn't he look smart? He's got a very intelligent look. I love that she's been able to find these views of each artist so we can get a little glimpse of what they look like, separate from their art. Next slide. Now here we have a beautiful photograph of Margaret Blanche Polk. Margaret Blanche Polk's husband was a photographer, and Tuskegee University in Alabama was where he was centered. And she, with that very exotic look, he had the ability to manipulate the tonal qualities of a photograph to emphasize the compelling psychological portrait of the sitter. Now, the Tuskegee Air Force that was there in the 40s would go to this lady with her lovely exotic look. She was the owner of the Golden Tiger Cafe, and they frequented that. But she was also a physical therapist. Now, she had 9 children, and all of these children emerged and stayed in the middle class. They all became professionals in different professions, and so she and her husband did very well. Next slide. And here he is. Here's Prentice Polk. He wasn't that well known in the 50s, but in the 70s, he got a little more recognition. But he was part of a group of photographers, artists that wanted to show African Americans in a better light, and not have them just have to see the caricatures and the movies that showed them in a poor light. He wanted to show that African Americans were affluent and just as middle class as anyone else. Next slide. Now here we have a wonderful plaster bust that looks like it's made out of a very, very special metal. And there is a larger copper statue like this at MoMA. This Augusta Savage based this on her own nephew. She had a nephew about this age, and it's considered one of the first sculptures of a little Black boy of the period. Now he's wearing his traditional bebop cap, and it's tilted to one side. He's got a little bit of attitude showing, because again, she wanted to show what an African-American boy looked like and to be proud of it. And she studied in the United States and also studied in France. And gamin is a French word for street urchin, which this young man probably was, a wonderful street urchin. And as I say, the first example of a sculpture of a little black boy of the period, and also what a boy in the 30s would have looked like. Now, she was also someone who painted portraits, and she did some of the African-American leaders of the time, and she was known for her portraits. But this specific little statue is one that several museums have. And as I say, MoMA has a larger one. Next slide. And here she is. Doesn't she have a gentle, sensitive looking face? Next slide. Now, here's another photographer. This is a couple in their raccoon coats by James Van Der Zee. Now, he knew when he was 16 that he wanted to be a photographer, and he set up a studio in Harlem. He was part of these Harlem artists that wanted to show that African Americans were affluent too, and that they were just like everybody else. And he interestingly said, I had to write this down because it was so funny. Sometimes his photographs seemed to be more valuable to him than it was to the people who were portrayed in the photographs, because he put his heart and soul into these photographs to give the best possible view of African Americans at the time. Next slide. And here he is, kind of a jaunty sense of humor. Looks like he has a lovely straw hat. Next slide. Now, this is Roland Hayes by Reginald Gammon. Now, Roland was one of the first African-American lyric tenors. Became very popular. He performed with symphony orchestras, and he even performed in London for the King of England. Now, he was born in 1887, and it was at a plantation where his parents were tenant farmers, and in fact, his mother had been a slave at that same plantation back before the Emancipation. Now, he sang spirituals as a young boy, and he loved to sing, but at 12 years old, he heard a recording of Enrico Caruso, and he said, that's what I want to do. And so he went to Fisk University and learned to sing and got all his other training that he needed. And then, excuse me, then he performed, as I said, with different symphonies, most notably with the Boston Symphony, where he performed at least 4 times. And he was, in spite of the segregation of the day, very successful as a lyric tenor. Now, the artist who painted this is Reginald Gammon. And next slide is going to show us the artist. Here's Reginald. I love the hat, and I love the slouch. I love a little bit of the attitude. It's cute. And he was part of a group of Black artists called the Spiral, and they were devoted to social and economic issues, showing what was going on in the African-American world. But he also had a black and white palette, which is why that picture of the singer was in black and white. Next slide. Now, here we have the art of the Negro. This is done by Hale Woodruff. Hale Woodruff is trying to show, and again, it's a study, because he's going to paint a larger mural, and does, at Atlanta University, Clark University in Atlanta. And he wanted to show the students all the different kinds of professions that African Americans, artistic and otherwise, professions that African Americans were successful at. And it shows some of the tools of what makes them so successful. In the top row, far on the left in a brown jacket, is Henry Osawa Tanner. Now, in 1936, he went to Mexico and he studied under Diego Rivera, because he was very impressed with what the Mexican mural did to teach their history and to teach indigenous people who couldn't read and write that well, to teach them about their background and what had happened and what they could be proud of. And that's what he was trying to do here. Next slide. And here we see the 17 different people that are outlined. And there's so many professions. They're artists, they're poets, they're writers, they're singers, they're politicians, they're, oh, so many different ways they were successful. And he wanted these students at Clark University to see there was a lot of things they could do, like their predecessors, which are here, to be successful in the world, and they didn't have to accept any limitations at all. Next slide. And what a lovely, lovely photograph of this wonderful educator, Dale Woodruff, who went, as I say, to all the trouble to go to Mexico to make a proper mural, because mural art is very difficult. It's based on Greek and Roman training, and these muralists in Mexico, as I say, plus our wonderful Diego Rivera, were so good at it that he wanted to go to the source so that he could properly represent what he wanted to show. Next slide. Now here we have, after John Brown's capture, he was put to trial for his life in Charlestown, Virginia. And here we see John Brown bending over a cross that he's holding, and the artist, Jacob Lawrence. He was part of a Harlem group of artists called the Harlem Renaissance, that again wanted to present not only accurate pictures of African Americans, but wanted to show a little bit of their history, a little bit of the things they could be proud of. And one of those things is John Brown. Now, John Brown was a white preacher who felt that he had a calling from God to free the slaves. And he really endeavored to get up a group of people to help free the slaves before emancipation. And unfortunately, it came to a bad end at Harper's Ferry, where the government killed him. Next slide. And here he is. There he is at the base of the cross. And of course, Jesus bleeding with the cross, giving you a sense that the series is not going to play out very well. Now, how did he do this series? He, born in and raised in Harlem, and they had enough, problems there, but he went to the South for his honeymoon. He went to New Orleans, where he was in the extreme South, and he experienced segregation for the first time in all its horrors. And his darling bride allowed him to take some time, because he was so upset by it, to do this series on John Brown's life, because he was so proud of this man who gave up his life, even if they weren't freed, to try to free them. And he did this series in what is known as gouache, which is a very sensitive watercolor. Next slide. Now, these are screen prints. The DIA commissioned Jacob Lawrence in the early 70s to do the whole series again in screen prints, because I've seen the gouache maybe about, over 10 years ago, but I've never seen it since. It does not come out very often because it is so very sensitive. Now, screen prints are sensitive to light too, but not as bad. And this also explains the rotation pattern that the DIA has. You will see from the very beginning, when John Brown first starts out, 3 of his adventures, and every few months they rotate, and you see another 3, and it keeps rotating until you've seen all 22. Now, the critics loved this series because of his use of color, because of his sense of drama, because of the way he illustrated John Brown's experience. So this is really one of our more popular exhibits within the African American galleries on the 2nd floor in the North Wing. Next slide. And here he is. Now, doesn't he have a sensitive, gentle face also? Very serious, very intense. And I can see him getting very distressed about being treated badly and wanting to celebrate this man's life and express it in an art form that everyone could understand and everyone could like. And also to bring a little bit of this history of John Brown to the attention of African-American people. Next slide. Now here we have Huey Lee Smith. Now a lot of Huey Lee Smith's paintings do involve pictures of urban decay and urban neighborhoods, and they often will have a young person in them. And that young person is a metaphor for a lot of different things. It could be sometimes for desolation, for poverty, but it also could be a symbol of hope, a symbol of perhaps things can get better, perhaps they'll change. Now, the DIA had a contest in 1953, and this is the painting that Huey submitted, and he won. He won this contest, and the DIA bought the painting. Now, Huey was born in Florida, and when he was 10, he came up to Cleveland, and then he came to Detroit, and he studied at what the Center for Creative Studies, the old name that it used to be called, and then he went to Wayne, and he became an art professor at Wayne State University. He was very proud of having done this painting, and he is quoted after he won the prize, and he said, "I was no longer called a Black artist or a Negro artist or a colored boy. Instead, when I won the prize, I was simply, and not given a racial description at all, I was simply an artist." How wonderful that was for him. And we have several of Huey Lee Smith's works. This is just the only one in this particular presentation, but you need to come to see them in person. Next slide. And here he is. He did a self-portrait, and he shows himself a wee bit arrogantly with his head up a little bit, proud of what he's done. But look at his photograph. His photograph is the real Huey with a lovely smile and not at all arrogant. I think he was just trying to show himself off a little better in his own self-portrait. But that smile is just beautiful. Next slide. Now here we have a wonderful head by Elizabeth Catlett. She was a sculptor who loved to show the strength and dignity of both African women and African-American women. Here she's celebrating two cultures, the Mesoamerican culture of Mexico, because large heads, very similar, big rounded heads were found on the shore of Mexico, but it also is showing in the texture of the hair that of African women. On the next slide, we're going to see some other sides of this beautiful head. It's really quite breathtaking. Now, Elizabeth Catlett knew right away she didn't want to live in the United States. She didn't like the way African Americans were treated. So she moved to Mexico. She married a Mexican artist, Francisco Moya. She had children, and she became the first woman to be a sculpture professor at the University of Mexico. And she just passed on a few years ago, and she worked right up to the end of her life at that university, teaching others how to sculpt. And she did wonderful sculptures of African-American women or African women, again, showing their strength and their dignity. She felt art should be approachable and available to all. And there's a really neat story that I put together that I think is very cool. There she was, a professor of art at the University of Mexico, and an artist we're going to see in a few minutes was protesting the lack of exhibits for minorities at the Metropolitan Museum at the same time. So there she was demonstrating her skill while the skill of others were not even being recognized. Now that to me is very telling, and I'm grateful that it's better now than it was then. Next slide. And isn't that a wonderful face? Doesn't she look like she would be fun to know? That and she loved Mexico so much that she became a Mexican citizen. And she also studied with Diego Rivera and learned some of his techniques as well. Next slide. Now this is a wall hanging that looks like weavings. She's done it very tightly and close together because it's based on weavings that would have been done by African women in some of their societies. And that's her own body that we see outlined. She's got three versions of her body there, and it looks like it's a crime scene because she is talking about, she's contemporary now, and she's going into the social and political injustice that people feel all over the world, where their lives are imperiled, or their resources, or their culture, or just so much interference with their life. And she's taken headlines out of newspapers where they've whitewashed events or they've colored over what's really happening. And so we see little tiny explanations of how horrible things are and what's going on. And the paint is very thick and very heavy, and it represents both injuries, but it also represents that maybe things will get better. The fact that there's hope for the future here too. But if she is commenting on the political problems of her day. Next slide. Oh, one more thing before you leave. That Air CS 560, that is a tear gas that's made in Pennsylvania, her home state. And it was used in Vietnam, and this tear gas destroyed people. So she is showing the destruction that this tear gas can cause. Next slide. And here she is. And she also has this kind of gentle demeanor for such strong political statements. Next slide. Now this is by Edward Clark, Maple Red. Now he was a veteran of World War II, and on the GI Bill, he both went to college at the Chicago Art Institute, has a school, and he studied there, and he went to Europe and studied in France, and he was very, very contemporary. And he used a push broom here to push the art across the page. And it's made out of very interesting material. It's made out of dried pigments, sawdust, and pencil shavings. Now it's lasted so far, but conservationists are concerned 100 years from now, how are they going to conserve pencil shavings? But since none of us are going to be here 100 years from now, the next group of people are going to have to worry about it. Next slide. And there he is, very serious, very intense, interesting gentleman. Next slide. Now this is Portrait of a Ecologist by Benny Andrews. Benny Andrews was one of 10 children to a sharecropper's family, and he was the first one to graduate from high school. And he also went to the Art Institute of Chicago, to their art school, and he did that on the GI Bill from the war in Korea, the Korean War. And unlike what we just saw in the previous slide, his contemporaries were doing very avant-garde, very abstract things. He liked to do representational things, and he particularly liked collages. If you came to the museum, you would see that the material pouring out of that brown box, that's real material that he has put into the picture. And the painting that he's doing has bits and pieces cut out of another source, but they're real. And he's done something to the colors on his palette that makes it look like it's fresh and real. And we don't really know if he's looking at the scene that he's creating or if he's looking at us. Now, he was an advocate for minorities and for women. He was always protesting the lack of exhibits for them. In fact, he's the protester that protested when the other lady that we just saw in Mexico was so successful. That's how far behind the United States was at the time, that it was very difficult to get exhibits for people of color or people who were not like the white majority. Anyway, next slide. And here he is. He was also a teacher. And you can see how he tried in his self-portrait. He's got a bit of a face that he's made a little bit longer. He's made his beard a little bit longer. And in his portrait of himself, he's still got some black in his gray hair, but he's 100% white hair in his own portrait. But he has a very gentle looking face too. Next slide. Now, this is another local person, Tyree Guyton. If you've ever been over near downtown, we have the Heidelberg Project, where he's put a lot of found objects on houses. Because there was a French artist called Marcel Duchamp, who said that found objects were art also. And he has a background of that. His mother liked to go to garage sales, flea markets, and his grandfather was an artist. So this is something that he's gotten at a flea market. It's a cage, and stuffed into the cage is all this rope. And he's equating that with our brains. As adults, we stop asking questions. We stop being inquisitive. We stop caring about things. Children are so much more inquisitive and ask questions. And the older you get, the less inquisitive you become, till everything is kind of jammed into this cage. And you can see some of it's starting to spill out. And Tyree is urging us all to open up our thinking, open up our cages, and let our thoughts become more curious. Ask more questions. Don't be so set in our ways that we forget about questioning things and wondering how things are made and how things are done, like children do. Next slide. And here he is. He has a lovely disposition, and he has a lovely foundation carrying on his work. And as I say, very well known for the Heidelberg Project. Next slide. Now, this is Beyond Midnight. And you can't see it real well, but there's like a black cowl over the face of the woman in the middle of this work. And that cowl is kind of a representational something of a sack that might be on the face of a child when it's born. But she's also equating it with her culture, her African culture, that this woman is perhaps a spiritual seer, someone who's deep into the spiritual religion of the African American culture. And she has also gone to garage sales, and there are elements on this painting that are indicative of a spiritual seer. Next slide. Oops,
Did I
we missed
go?
something.
Okay.
Yeah, here we see different elements that she's gotten from garage sales that are indicative of the spirituality of the picture we're looking at. And the title is suggesting that at one point, Black skin was even looked down upon within the Black community as being less than desirable. And she's trying to show here that Black skin, because it's so representational of the spiritual seer, that it's just as important and just as valuable and just as beautiful as any other color that African Americans might possess or express. So it's a very interesting work of art. Next slide. And there she is, very interesting lady. Next slide. Now here we have Blood, Sweat, and Tears by Alison Saar. She is mourning the death of her father. He's a conservationist, Richard Saar, and she is talking about, she's talking about a woman's body after the middle of a woman's life, after childbearing years, and the process of aging and what it does to your body. And she has modeled this statue after her own body. So it's kind of tall, and then she's covered it in copper. And then we see all these teardrops covering every inch of her body, where she has grief just pouring out, oozing out of every pore, showing the depth of her grief for her father. And she's standing on a ceiling tile that's been taken from somewhere else because she feels it has a history that needs to be continued to be expressed. And so we see red veins showing the rupture of skin as someone ages. And as I say, the grief pouring out of her. This is a very, very dramatic piece. Next slide. And here she is. Very sweet little lady's face. Next slide. Now, this is a very interesting gentleman, Nick Cave, sound search. As docents, we went to Chicago and we met Nick Cave, And we even saw his studio. And what he did was he responded to the beating of Rodney King by the LA police in the early 90s. And he created this opportunity, this sound suit, and it's made out of I'll tell you that in a minute. But what he says is once he puts on this sound suit, he settles with himself. He doesn't say anything for a little bit, and then he becomes more anonymous. He is no longer necessarily a Black person, but now he's got this wonderful cover over him, and no one's thinking of him in racial terms. And it's made up of fibers, metal, and buttons suspended on plastic tags. And we saw tons of little drawers with all these different materials, and they make sound when you move. And that's the importance of these sound suits. It not only gives anonymity to the wearer, it gives a sense of freedom to the wearer. And the wearer is no longer defined anymore by race. He's defined simply by the suit he's wearing. Next slide. And there he is on the left, playing with the material, and on the right, dancing with one of the sound suits. And these have been used in Europe and the United States. And our sound suit isn't seen very often because it's made out of material. So it's very sensitive to light and air and atmosphere. So it only comes out occasionally. But what a dramatic statement he makes here, where the person can be absorbed by what they're wearing. And there's freedom in that. And there's no labeling anymore in that. And what an interesting way of expressing himself. Next slide. Now here we have a lady who's called the Mistress of Beadwork, Joyce Scott. And we see skeletons, and it reminds us all a little bit of the Day of the Dead, but it's all made up of beads. And in the Day of the Dead, the transition to death is a new phase of existence. And Joyce feels like we should be honest with kids and tell them what's going on. But she has a very interesting background. She's Native American, she's African American, and she's of Scottish descent. As I say, this whole beautiful thing is made out of beads. Next slide. And look at that jolly look. She looks like an imp. She's a marvelous sense of humor. Next slide. Now, this is another glorious work done by a local artist, Noah's Ark Genesis by Charles McGee. And he just passed on not that long ago. And he has his work is in the People Mover at the Broadway station. He has a sculpture at the Rackham Building next door to the DIA, at the African American Museum outside. And he came from the Carolinas when he was 10 to Detroit, and he spent a lot of time out in nature. And he couldn't read or write, but he said, I can't be defined by that. I'm more than that. And of course, he learned to read and write. He also went to the Center for Creative Studies, what it was originally called, and went on to art school. And this is his reaction to what he called the rebellions of the Black rebellions in 43 and in 67. And he felt that this was wrong. So Noah's Ark, the ark stands as a symbol of salvation, of being saved. And here we see nature and man getting along just beautifully together. And it's a collage because what they're wearing is mud cloth. It would be made in African villages for special occasions. And this is salvation, so it's a special occasion. And that wonderful snake is wrapped around these figures, these African figures, and different animals are in it. And it's got a real rope on it, and there's a real bee on there. And like I say, material, and it's huge. It fills the whole wall. Right now, when you go to the DIA and you get off the elevator on the south entrance, it's right there in the area outside where the Van Gogh exhibit had been. And so there's just this marvelous wall for it to fill. And it's a glorious, glorious work of art. And Charles McGee would come to the DIA, sometimes lecture, sometimes just walk around. And he was very active in his studio in Detroit. And he was someone that we can be proud of, a very good, strong local artist. Next slide. And here he is looking in his younger days, very jolly and kind of optimistic. Next slide. Now here's another wonderful work by Romare Bearden. This is also on the second floor of the south wing, right out of the elevator. It fills the whole wall. This is made out of glass. And this is from his childhood in the Carolinas, when they had quilting bees and community get-togethers, and they play music and have a good time. And this was commissioned by the DIA in 1985 to celebrate our 100th anniversary. And so he had this made. It's very, very heavy. It does not move. It stays on a wall. But think about life. Life is all different pieces of a puzzle that you put together over your life, and different experiences make up the puzzle. And what he did was he made a smaller work and sent it to Italy. And these Italian manufacturers created this collage to his direction, to his design, and then back it came. And so we're quite proud of this wonderful work by Romare. Next slide. And here he is with his cat. Next slide. Now this is Bird by David Hammond. Now again, going back to that French artist Marcel Duchamp, that everything is art, that found objects are art. That's what David's doing here. He's found this bird cage, and it makes reference to a marvelous musician called Charlie Bird Parker, who played the saxophone and whose music David liked to listen to. It also makes reference, both with the bird cage and the basketball within it, to the Boston Celtics, who had a player in the 90s called the Bird, and he retired. And go to the next slide. You also see feathers and a netting around that basketball, because he is suggesting that people tell Black youth that they can become basketball players and be successful and famous, yet there are really very few opportunities for anyone to be successful in that sport. Better, he thinks, that they should be encouraging youth to become educators and lawyers and doctors. That is going to be much easier to accomplish than becoming a basketball player. Next slide. And there he is. He is a very private man. He doesn't promote himself. He promotes others, other minorities and other people to help them with their careers. And we're very grateful. We have this wonderful African-American curator that's dedicated to finding these works of art, to helping us expand our collection, because General Motors gave us the dedicated funds in 2000 to have this dedicated African-American curator. And because of her, we have continued to be avant-garde in terms of finding these people and having examples of their work. And the variety is marvelous. Next slide. Now, this is another one. Long before he became famous, this is Kehinde Wiley, officer of the Hussars. We got it, or it was done in 2007. But remember, he's the gentleman who was the person that painted Barack Obama, painted his portrait that's now in the National Gallery. And we got our painting before that portrait in the National Gallery. So we were ahead of the curve here. He's also done the frame, and it's enormous. Again, on the second floor in the south wing, when you get off the elevator, you're going to see this as well, filling a whole wall. And what he does, he takes his papers showing that he's an artist, and he goes to a large city. He goes to Los Angeles or Chicago or New York, and he approaches a young man on the street and said, "Would you like to have your portrait painted?" "Oh, yes." Takes him back to his studio, has him look through art history books, because Kehinde is a fully trained artist, and he doesn't feel there are enough Black representation in paintings in museums. Well, in this case, the young man picked this French portrait. Now Kendi changes it enough so that it's still original, but he keeps elements there. And the minute you put somebody on a horse, they become powerful and strong and a commanding figure. In fact, the young man said, when he saw it, you caught the spirit within me. Because if you saw this fellow on the street, you wouldn't pay any attention to him at all. But when you put him on a horse, wow, you pay attention. But he let the young man keep his identity. He has Timberlake shoes on. He's got the low flung jeans on. He's got the wife beater t-shirt. He's got his tattoos. But yet, like the French picture that we're going to see in a minute, he has a scimitar. He has the same kind of saddle that the French officer would have had. The horse is rearing up. There's a battlefield below him. But then there are other changes. There's gold swirling around the painting. And that's to represent the bling of African-American culture in both sports and entertainment. Next slide. And here you can see the French painting it was based on and the changes made. But the young man still has his identity. He's not put into the same clothes. But I love the coat he has flung out. And I love that wonderful animal saddle with the head of the, whatever it is, tiger or somebody. And you can see, as I say, the battlefield below. And when you go anywhere in this series of young men on horses, you know immediately it's a Kehinde Wiley painting. Because again, the Dosons had a trip to New York, and we went into the Brooklyn Museum, and there in their foyer was a Kehinde Wiley. So they were early on adapters of him as well. Next slide. And here we see him. And he's in front of another work of art he's done, and he's painting one off to the right. We had an exhibit of African-American artists, and some huge, huge Kehinde Wileys were on exhibit. And in fact, at the gift shop, they sold beach towels by Kehinde Wiley. And I bought a beach towel because it was so glorious. Next slide. Now here we have Something You Can Feel. This is by Micheline Thomas. And the material here it's a collage, and it's made out of acrylic paint and oil enamel, but there are rhinestones on it and glitter and beading, and it's applied to wood panels to create light and texture, and it's based on fashion. This particular work is based on fashion styles. Back in the day, her mother was a fashion model, and there were Black magazines called Ebony and Jet, in essence, that showed fashionable African-American women showing off the fashions of the day. And that's what we see here. And all the colors and textures of the period are brought out as well. Now, what she will do is she'll set up a scene in her studio and get a model to come in, depending on what she's trying to accomplish. Then she cuts it up and she places it on these wood panels and puts all this extra stuff on it, so that literally it is another huge, huge work. And you want to touch it, but you can't. You're not supposed to. But the beading and the glitter and the glamour of it really calls out to you. Next slide. And here she is, very serious for doing such fashion design. Next slide. Now, this is another one of our latest works by Mario Moore. He is showing his grandmother. His grandmother is holding pictures of his father and his uncle, and she's holding them proudly. She's an activist for the public school system, and all of these young men have come through the public school system, and she's holding them proudly. They're alive and well and doing well, and this is in contrast to the pictures we see that never seem to end of the mothers who are holding pictures of their slain sons who've been killed by policemen. But this is not the same thing. Now he's put it on copper, and Rubens, the famous painter, Rubens used copper. You have to really treat copper properly, scrape it and do other things to it to get it to accept paint. And that also emphasizes the importance of it because of the material it's painted on. So we're seeing the importance of this grandmother in his life and in the lives of these young men whose pictures she's holding. She's very, very important and very active in her support and advocacy of the public education system. Next slide. And here she is. You know, she's just this loveliest everyday lady standing next to the artist who will get us a fully trained artist, but who wants the world to see his grandmother and her accomplishments. And this is the end of our presentation.
Very good.
Oh, fantastic.
But it's a lovely, lovely sampling of what we have at the DIA. Because of this African American curator. And we have more new work by him as well. So it's fun.
When you talked about Jacob Lawrence, you used that word